Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to the 25th meeting in 2019 of the Finance and Constitution Committee. The usual reminder about mobile phones, please. The first item on our agenda this morning is to take evidence, to decide whether we take item 4 in private. Are members agreed? Agreed. Members are agreed. The second item on today's agenda is to consider the Scottish statutory instrument which provides for the 2019 autumn budget revision. Before we come to the motion seeking our approval at agenda item 3, we have an evidence session on the order. We are joined for this session by Kate Forbes, who is the Minister for Public Finance and Digital Economy, who is accompanied by Scott Mackay of the Scottish Government. And I invite the Minister, if she so wishes, to make a short opening statement.
I'll speak very briefly, Convener. Thanks for having me here. As committee members will know, the autumn budget revision is the first of 2 opportunities to formally amend the Scottish budget for 2019-20, and we've once again provided a brief guide to the autumn budget revision prepared by officials to committee members. This year's autumn budget revision deals with, as usual, 4 different types of amendments. The first is a few funding changes. Second is technical adjustments that have no impact on spending power. Third is a small number of Whitehall transfers, and finally some budget neutral transfers of resources within portfolios. And the net impact of all of these changes is an increase in the approved budget of £536.9 million, taking the budget to just over £43 billion. And table 1.2 on page 5 of the supporting document shows the approved portfolio budgets following the changes sought in this revision. If I could just really briefly go through each of those changes in turn. The first set of changes includes the deployment of funding across multiple portfolios to cover most of the costs incurred by public bodies as a result of the increase to employer pension contributions, additional funding for the teachers' pay settlement, financial transactions for transport for the low carbon transport fund, and further funding for peatlands. So that's in total the funding changes, and that increases the budget by £497.1 million. The second set of adjustments, which are the technical adjustments, bring the budget, have a net impact of £26.9 million on the aggregate position, and those adjustments are largely necessary to ensure that the budget is consistent with accounting requirements and with the final outturn that will be reported in our annual accounts. Thirdly, the Whitehall transfers and allocations from Treasury, there's a net positive impact on the budget of £13.1 million, and that relates to largely quite small transfers for money advice services, Sure Start, maternity grant, single gateway project, GovTech Catalyst, cyber security and Forestry Commission UK cross-border functions. And the final and the last part of the budget revision concerns the transfers of funds within and between portfolios, which committee members will be familiar with, and that's to better align the budgets with profiled spending. And as in past years, there are a number of internal portfolio transfers which have no effect on portfolio totals, but ensure that internal budgets are monitored and managed effectively. And all these transfers between portfolios are noted in the supporting document. And just lastly, as I close, as we move towards the financial year end, we'll continue in line with normal practice to monitor forecast outturn against budget and, wherever possible, seek to utilise any emerging underspend to ensure we make optimum use of resources available in 2019-20, and also to manage the flexibility provided under the Fiscal Framework Agreement between Treasury and the Scottish Government. And I'll be providing committee with a mid-year report on revenue and spending to date alongside the spring budget revision when published, to try and support improved transparency of the budget management process. And on that, I will close and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Minister. Adam Tompkins will certainly begin the questions this morning.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. You've provided the committee with a document which you quite rightly call a brief guide. Can I take you to paragraph 6 of that document, Minister, which says, which is about the funding changes, which total £497.1 million. And you say that this additional funding is mainly sourced from Barnett consequentials, the reserve and additional tax receipts. I've got 3 questions about that sentence. One, what do you mean by mainly? Two, what is the breakdown, what is the split between what comes from Barnet, what comes from the reserve, and what comes from additional tax receipts? And thirdly, what additional tax receipts are you talking about?
Okay. So in terms of mainly, and I think mainly was related to pensions, is that right? Was related to, could you ask your first question
again? The additional funding is mainly sourced from Barnet consequentials, the reserve and additional tax receipts. So that would imply that there are additional funding sources in addition to those three which are not specified, and I want to know what they are.
Yeah, no, understood. So probably the most useful table is 1.7a, and 407.5 million of the funding drawn down is already anticipated in arriving at the final budget figures, and that's augmented by additional allocation during the progress of the budget bill through Parliament, including late consequentials, which are separately shown in table 1.7a, and which Treasury agreed allowed us to carry forward because they were allocated so late in the day. So the additional 497.1 million of reserve funding is then used to support the ABR changes. Now, we do not ring-fence the sources of the funding to how they are spent. So in terms of the split of that 497.1 million, as you'll see from table 1.7A or B, I think it is, you'll see that some of that comes from Barnet consequentials, and some of it will come from reserve. And within the reserve, there will be, for example, additional tax receipts as well as carry forward figures. Does that answer your question in terms of mainly?
So what's there in addition to Barnet reserve and additional tax receipts is money that was carried forward from the previous financial year?
Yes. Right. So if you look at table 1.7a, I think this is your question, was deployed at autumn budget revision. You've got the 497.1. Right. If you look at 1.7b, you'll see sources of funding for proposed changes, and you'll have deployment from unallocated funds, that's 227.2 million, yeah. And then the HMT contribution to fund increase employer pension costs for public bodies, 269.9 million. So that's quite clear that that has come through Barnet consequentials specifically for employer pension increases. Okay. And in terms of the 227.2 million, that essentially comes from reserve. What is in the reserved is highlighted 1.7a, which includes the closing reserve balance that was carried forward from last year. And in that, you will have all forms of funding that have been put into the reserve. You will also have the breakdown that's provided just above in terms of some late consequentials, also in terms of some carry forward from the movement in a provisional outturn.
And what are the additional tax receipts?
In terms of the...
I think there was 5 over what was forecast. I think, was that detailed in the Fiscal Framework Outturn report? I'm not sure I have that with me. But I think the additional tax receipts over and above what was previously forecast, I think from memory, came out at 5.
That's the figure that I've got as well.
But I can certainly check that when I get.
What tax are we talking about? Income tax or LBTT?
This is fully devolved taxes.
Yeah, fully devolved taxes.
Yeah.
So not income tax.
So not income tax. Right. No, that's reconciled much later on in the process.
Okay. I think if I'm right, if I recall correctly, most of it is LBTT.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
I'm sorry, Murdo. No. Oh, sorry. Apologies, Patrick. Did have a follow up on that area, didn't you?
No, it's okay.
Okay. Right. Murdo.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Good morning, Minister. I wanted to ask about the allocation of 141 million to the communities and local government portfolio for funding the teachers' pay settlement. Has this money now been paid to local councils, and if not, when will that happen?
Has the money been deployed to local? Yes. So this this movement to teachers' pay has been made, and that's why it's included in our in this revision.
So local councils have had that money already?
So the figure has been deployed. Yes, we have deployed that figure of the 141 million.
Okay. And
that's for 19. That's just for 1920, of course.
Yeah. So yeah, this is in the current financial year. So
yeah.
councils have had that money. That's fine. And will the local government budgets be rebased to include that figure?
So in terms of the discussions around what local authorities will get for the next financial year, that will be a discussion with COSLA, which will commence as part of the budget process. But in terms of the teachers' pay deal, there has already been an agreed financial contribution for this year, for last year, and for next year. So, for example, next year it is to be £156 million to fund the teachers' pay deal. So that brings the total amount to £307 million.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. John?
Thanks, Convener. In the table 17.7b you were referring to, you mentioned the figure 269.9 million, which was the HMT contribution to fund increase in employer pension costs for public bodies. Could you just explain to us the kind of background of that and why that's come?
Yep, so that came about because of a change at Treasury level to increase the discount rate, and that had a flow-through impact on employers' pension contributions in the public sector. And initial commitments by Treasury were that, particularly when it came to health, that those additional costs would be funded in full, but they haven't been funded in full. So the Scottish ministers have been pressing the UK government to meet the full additional costs, which would come in excess of 500 million. So in terms of the settlement, the Barnett consequentials are highlighted there in terms of £269.9 million. There was some additional money that came from Treasury as well to health. So in total, the Barnett consequentials to meet that 500 million cost of increased employers' contributions was 391.8 million. So Scottish Government has tried to mitigate the shortfall with funding, and in some cases some of the funding has been mitigated within portfolio areas rather than through additional resource.
Okay, some of this is quite technical, obviously. So if it's 391 is the total we've received, we're short, apparently short of 108 or 109 or thereabouts. So now these pension funds, I mean, we've got obviously the local authority pension funds where the money is actually sitting in a pot, but I take it these are other public employees whose money is not sitting in a pot and their pensions are just paid out of normal expenditure.
So this, yes, relates to basically NHS, teachers, civil service, police and fire, and judges. So it and it relates. It's quite specific in terms of, if you want the full technical details.
Well, try me.
Employer contributions for public service pensions are set by a quadriennial scheme valuations that are based on Treasury directions, which specify the discount rate as being the SCAPE, the superannuation contributions adjusted for past experience rate. So when Treasury changes the discount rate, then that has a knock-on impact on employer contributions, which of course then hits the public sector. And at the time, particularly for health, UK government committed to meet those costs, but those were not met in full.
Okay, try again. Thanks.
Yes, sir. Just supplementary to that specific.
Well, that's what I'm going.
When you go.
Are these real cash payments? Because presumably, if the discount rate is changing, that means the liability for somebody's pension over the next 30, 40, whatever years is changing. But the actual cash being paid out would be spread over these 40 years. So, what is the cash position in this?
Seeing as it's so technical, I'll ask Scott if he wants to.
So, I mean, these are increases in the amount of cash that need to be paid across in respect of each of these employers.
Who are we paying that money to?
We're paying that to Treasury, who then, or to the, for each of these pension schemes. So these are unfunded schemes, as you rightly referred to. So all the contributions get paid in, and then there's an assessment on where that falls in relation to the commitments in that year, and then that is topped up to meet all the cash outgoings.
So although there's not an actual fund, the Treasury is effectively sitting on these contributions.
Yeah, the Treasury take all, they take all these contributions and essentially they top them up, other than for police and fire, where Scottish Government are 100% responsible for the full costs of that pension scheme.
Okay, that's
so
me, I think.
Can I just dig down a bit more about this issue with the Treasury? If I got that right, it's around about £109 million. There's a potential, I guess the government would call a shortfall. First of all, if you could confirm that's right, and also tell us where the discussions with Treasury have got in that regard.
So, initial commitments were made, particularly for health. So I'm distinguishing health from the other areas. At the beginning, when this was announced, it was in discussions with Treasury, it was agreed, or there was a commitment made, that the additional costs would be fully funded, particularly for health, in light of the fact that it is a Treasury decision, it is a policy decision on health. And when it came to the allocation, Scotland received a consequential that was based on the allocation to the Department for Health. But there are differences in the makeup of the workforce in the Scottish NHS versus the Department of Health. So that allocation was not sufficient to meet the full costs of the increase in employer contributions for the NHS in Scotland. So Scottish Government then stepped in to mitigate the gap, as it were, between what was needed to cover the costs and what was being provided to cover the costs.
And where are these discussions with Treasury got to?
Well, I mean, they were ongoing for some time, but we're now into, I mean, unless there is a, I mean Treasury have made their allocation for the pension costs, and I don't think that we envisage any additional consequentials coming to cover these costs. I think that consequential was given as a consequence of discussions with Treasury. That has been provided. We have then stepped in to mitigate the gap.
I'm going to come back. I'm going to go to Neil first. Sorry, John.
So the Scottish Government have stepped in to cover the full cost for the health service. So the 207.7 million covers the total increase in health.
Sorry, 207. There was already a kind of baseline contribution for pensions within the health uplift for that year. So the full costs for health are.
So there'll be no shortfall in the health.
Yeah.
So the 109 million is a. You've allocated 60.8 to the communities and local government budget. Does that cover the full costs to local authority increases in pension contributions?
Sorry, where are you seeing that figure?
So
Pensions.
it's Annex 1, communities and local government additional funding for the increase in employer pension contributions, 60.8 million within the communities and local government budget. Does that cover the full burden of increase on local authorities? Is there a shortfall going to fall there?
There is a shortfall.
Of how much?
That covers roughly about 80% of the costs of the teachers' pension contribution changes. That was an allocation of a proportion of the funding that we received from the UK government, topped up to 80% to try and meet the kind of assessment was what was affordable was to manage that 80% contribution, which was broadly consistent with a kind of commitment that that there would be funding available for 80% of the costs.
So local authorities could be facing
the
increased costs
of around how much roughly?
Well, that's 80% of the costs.
So 8%, so another 20% of that.
Another 15 million.
Okay, 15 million.
I mean, in terms of the other areas, I don't know if it's helpful, but I've obviously mentioned. Sorry.
That's a question first before. So unless you finish,
Was there any if there was any other big areas that were facing shortfalls, that would be useful.
The way that we divvied it up, so we've provided 100% for health, Police and fire pensions are we're responsible for 100% of the costs, and for other areas we've sought to balance the funding contribution at broadly 80% of the costs. And there are some areas where funding is particularly tight. We've tried to support 100%, but that's sort of the breakdown when it comes to covering the employer contributions.
John.
It was just to follow up one of your answers, I think, to the convener, which was you said this was a policy decision by the Treasury. I mean, is that in fact a case? Is it something that they had much leeway on, or is this just something that's being dictated by the actuaries?
It is related to a technical decision on the future liabilities of the fund.
Which is related to interest rates, stock
longevity,
exchange, people, how long people live, all these things. Yes, that's right. So it is actually quite a technical adjustment.
It is.
Right.
But I think that, I mean, it's worth saying that at the beginning there was a recognition that it was a decision taken by Treasury, and that's why the initial commitment came to meet 100% of health costs.
Thank you.
Okay. Patrick. Excuse me.
Just looking at the inter-department transfers, just so that I can understand what's going on with that, the summary, the short briefing that you provided indicates what specific measures these transfers are going toward, but are they being taken away from other priorities, or were they already budgeted for the things that are set out in that summary? And if so, why weren't they simply included in the departments they're moving to in the first place?
It's a fair question, and I think it comes up at most of the revision sessions. The reason why we do this every time is because at the budget setting process, the policy that's responsible, in other words, the minister that is responsible for that policy, has that funding line in their portfolio. But in terms of where the spending actually occurs, we make a transfer during the autumn budget revision. So, for example, I know that the health and sport to education and skills transfer has come up in the past, and that's the 60 million. And it's a good example because whilst obviously midwifery training and nursing training and education clearly falls into the health minister's responsibilities, the actual spending occurs in the education portfolio. So that's funding for 10,000 nursing and midwifery students' tuition fees in the academic year. So Jean Freeman is responsible for that policy area. So it's right that when there's discussions on the budget, there is maximum scrutiny and transparency of who is responsible. But when it comes to the actual process of spend, it is spent within the education portfolio, and that would be true of all the other transfers as well.
Of all of the transfers. So just to be clear, none of the inter-department transfers represent a change of what's intended to be spent?
No. Okay. The only increase in funding in any of these revisions comes through the funding points we've already discussed in terms of pension contributions, etc., and also some small increases through Whitehall transfers. All of these transfers are budget neutral.
That's helpful, thank you. I wanted to ask as well about one of the smaller areas where you're increasing something like the low carbon transport loan fund is getting an extra 17 million. How does the Scottish Government go about consulting on what the policy options might be when the opportunity exists to increase a budget line there? I mean, the low carbon transport loan fund is effectively subsidised credit for businesses to buy vehicles. There might well be some merit in giving an incentive for low carbon vehicles, but there might be stakeholders or members of the public or organisations who would think you'd be better off spending that on an increase to the Community Renewables Fund, for example. How do those choices get made? Because obviously in a main budget there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of scrutiny, there's a lot of lobbying goes on. To what extent is this autumn budget process a period when members of the public or organisations can actually express a view about those choices?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the autumn budget revision, that will be the last point in the process, as it were. And a lot of these discussions about funding changes, the reason that we are revising it now is that there wasn't, either the decision was made later on in the day, or funding became available later on in the day. So in terms of consultation around the revision process, theoretically, all that consultation should already have happened, because these are quite technical changes of moving funding around or increasing funding for decisions that were already made but were made too late in the day to be recognised in the budget. So there should be that consultation and that discussion, but it should be part of the budget process. And in terms of that line in particular, I'd be happy to provide more detail as to what discussions happened in the run-up to that particular funding increase. But I assume it would be for either the Transport or the Environment Portfolio Minister to answer that question. But I'm assuming it was in light of our decisions around transition and low-carbon economy and additional investment in our climate change commitments.
So when would that specific decision have been made?
I would need to ask the relevant Portfolio Minister, because it's a decision for them, and then I take forward the funding changes.
That would be helpful to know. Thank you.
Alec.
Could I just pick up on that last point about the internal transfers? So that 120 million going into communities and local government, so take the school counselling services, for example.
Just the rest of us benefit. Alec, could you just identify where that is in terms of, is there a table?
Is there? Annex B.
Right, thanks.
So that, will that money there for next year be in the baseline budget of the local authorities?
Any discussions or decisions about baselining budgets and COSLA's budget is to be taken as part of the budget process, and those conversations with COSLA will be starting, if they're not already starting relatively soon, once we've got more detail on when the budget might be. So those kind of decisions will be taken. That particular 120 million is to ensure that every secondary school has counselling services, which also provides access for feeder, primary and special schools, giving them access to a counselling service. And that specific funding supports integration of those services to meet the costs of delivering the living wage for these services. So where those lines are related to, an initial decision, or a decision that was taken about an initial sum of money that is a one-off, then they wouldn't be baselined. Where there is a clear commitment going forward over the course, it's a commitment that's been made, and it's been made not just to 1 year, but it's clearly going to be a service that continues to be provided, then that discussion has to happen with COSLA in terms of their overall funding settlement.
Because is that not where you end up in difficulty, where take the counselling service, local authorities are advertising these posts on a temporary basis because of the uncertainty coming through the funding? An example in Fife that I'm aware of is GP practices, where you're getting mental health support workers attached to them, but because of the funding uncertainties, they are temporary contracts, and not only are they having difficulty in recruiting, but they're actually having real difficulty with retention as a result of people being on temporary contracts. So this type of budgeting, if I'm understanding it properly, is if it's not built into the baseline, then all these very important services, the local authorities or the health and social care partnerships are finding that they've got real troubles with recruitment and retention because of the uncertainty is shifting these funds, and rather than just put it into the baseline. If you're committed to doing these things, why would it not be in the baseline?
I think it's part of a much bigger discussion than just about baselining these sums. It's also about giving long-term certainty and being able to move to three-year budgets, for example, which I know would certainly come up in conversations with COSLA to be able to give that long-term certainty of what their budgets will look like, not just this year, but the next few years. Unfortunately, that's not the way that our budget is set. So even at this moment in time, not knowing when the budget might be, it's very difficult to, to look ahead to not just next year, but the next 3 years. So I recognise that every area of the public sector is looking for that long-term certainty, which I think is a much bigger issue than just baselining figures, which we recognise, we appreciate, and it would help if our budgets were set in that way so that we could then pass on that certainty.
But do you, Convener, do you recognise the difficulties that this type of budgeting is causing out there in areas like mental health provision, where you're trying to increase that provision, but recruitment, because of the uncertainty of the funding, and surely if you're committed to them, you should be able to therefore put in at the beginning of the year the correct funding, and if it's built into the baseline, then local authorities, although they've not got guarantees, one-year budgets, but most of their employees will be employed full time.
Well, I mean, that's why we've fully funded this service in particular. I take your point about uncertainty. I don't, however, think it's just a question about baselining, because discussions about the overall funding settlement will commence with COSLA very soon, and it's for them to discuss and make the case for what they believe that their funding needs are in the long term. Your point around short-term recruitment, I hear what you're saying. That's a decision for local authorities in terms of how long they can recruit for.
And could I just finally go back to the question that Murdo Fraser raised earlier about the teachers' pay settlement? Are you saying that the Scottish Government, because you seem to suggest, or maybe I just picked it up wrong, that the local authorities are guaranteed for the next 2 years or 3 years the funding for the teacher settlement, which the Scottish Government is paying for, but you're not building that into their baseline funding either? Well,
they're two very different discussions. There's a question here about baselining funding going forward, and that's a separate discussion. In terms of the teacher's pay, that is an agreed financial contribution that has been agreed and is public, and there's an awareness and understanding of what the Scottish Government has committed to providing to support the teacher's pay deal, because the offer is a 3-year deal of 3% from the 1st of April 2018, 3% from 1st of April 2019, and 3% from the 1st of April 2020, plus an additional 4% from the 1st of April 2019, supported financially by the Scottish Government to make changes to the main grade and the promoted post scales. So that's in the public domain. It's been agreed, and obviously COSLA and have the role as employers, but the Scottish Government has agreed to fund that. So I don't think it would be appropriate for a funding like that to be baselined. It's an agreed contribution that's been made, that's in the public domain, that's in addition to the funding settlement that local authorities will get.
Okay, Alec. Okay, we now in that case move to agenda item 3, which is consideration of the motion on the order. I invite the Minister to move motion S5M 19330 that the Finance and Constitution Committee recommends that the Budget Scotland Act 2019 Amendment Regulations 2019 draft be approved.
I move the motion in my name.
Do members have any further comments? There being no further comments, I now put the question. The question is that motion S5M 19330 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. In that case, just for the public record, the committee will publish a short report setting out our decision on the order, and I thank the Minister and their official for their evidence. At the start of the meeting, we agreed we'd take the next part in private, so I now suspend the meeting to allow our witnesses to leave. Thank you, Minister.